Hello and welcome. We're going to be reading The Bridge Builder's Code, Volume 1 by Jenny Jo Bingham. The dedication. For those who've walked away and for those still hoping they'll come back. This is for the sons, the daughters, the builders, and the ones holding blueprints that feel too heavy. May you find the courage to return and the grace to begin again. Chapter 1. Return to Silver Ridge. Jake Weston wasn't a fan of detours, literal or emotional, but here he was, taking both. His pickup rumbled down the cracked pavement of Main Street, freshly dusted with pine needles and that signature small town scent, a confusing blend of bakery bread, motor oil, and gossip. Somewhere behind that scent was a memory. Lemon bars cooling in Miley Grant's bakery window, the roar of Walt Cooper's truck, and the sound of his dad's laugh echoing across the job site. Small things, tucked like tools in the back of his mind. He hadn't meant to come back. In fact, he spent the better part of a decade ensuring he never would. But one thin envelope in shaky old handwriting had rerouted everything. Jake, there's something here that still belongs to you. Pastor Allen. The bridge. Of course it was the bridge. He parked his truck at the edge of the overlook, the same one where his father used to bring him after long work days, leaning his arm over Jake's shoulders as though trusting Jake's strength more than Jake trusted his own. Below, the unfinished frame of the bridge stretched halfway across the river like a sentence left unfinished. The steel beams had held up better than Jake's memories, though both were rusted at the edges. There had been plans once to finish the bridge by fall, host a town potluck on the new overlook, invite school kids to paint murals on the side. Now it was just an empty frame holding the weight of abandoned dreams. He sat in the truck for a long while, engine ticking as it cooled, the radio off. Silence in Silver Ridge had a way of creeping into your bones if you weren't careful. Even the wind seemed cautious, slipping between needles like it knew it was disturbing something sacred. From the cab, he could see the tips of the steel beams catching the last bit of sun. Somewhere under those beams, he dropped a set of pliers at 12 and cried like a baby, thinking he'd never find them. His dad had laughed and said, "Leave it. When you're older, you'll lose bigger things." Hadn't understood what he meant until now. A knock at the window startled him. Jake jumped, just slightly, and turned to see a familiar face framed in a mess of curly gray hair. Jake Weston, said Miley Grant, who had somehow not aged since his high school years, aside from acquiring a new layer of floral scent and a more aggressive approach to hugs. "I'd say look at you, but I already did. Twice. From the window at the bakery. You should wave when you come home." Jake climbed out of the truck, managing a smile. "Didn't know I was home." Miley smacked his arm with a gentle slap. "Oh, hush. You were born here. That makes it yours, whether you like it or not. Just like that nose of yours. Can't hide from it either." He chuckled despite himself. The town hadn't changed, but he had, and he wasn't sure what to do with that yet. "I suppose you're here about the bridge," Miley added, peering through the overlook like it was an old neighbor she still hadn't made peace with. Stubborn old thing, like your daddy. Wouldn't budge even when the town council gave up on it. Jake looked down at the river, watching it shimmer like time hadn't passed at all. "Yeah," he said quietly, "something like that." Jake hadn't planned on walking to the church, but his feet had other ideas. Somewhere between the overlook and Maple Avenue, the road stopped being pavement and started feeling like memory. Silver Ridge was the kind of place that quietly expected you to slow down. The sidewalks drifted like they were drawn by someone easily distracted, and every few feet held some new memory just waiting to ambush him. There was the lamppost he once wrapped in streamers the night of graduation. The mailbox he and Ev indented trying to skateboard downhill on a dare. The faded mural of the town square, his father's name, still legible at the bottom in chipping black paint. T. Weston, volunteer foreman. As he passed Cooper's hardware, the old bell above the door gave a weak clang, and out stepped Walt Cooper himself, thinner, grayer, and still wearing his lucky red vest. Jake Weston. Well, I'll be, Walt said, squinting like the sun owed him an explanation. I figured we'd see you again, but not before the Lord returned. Jake smirked. Yeah, well, the Lord sent a letter. It wasn't the first time Walt had delivered a line like that, and probably wouldn't be the last. The man had a whole filing cabinet of front porch zingers, and half of them ended with a weather report or a Bible reference. Walt let out a low whistle and leaned on the doorframe. That sounds like Pastor Allen. Man's got away with divine guilt. You hear about your daddy's bridge? Jake's smile faltered. He nodded, just looking around. Walt grunted. Your daddy was a good man, built like a tank and twice as stubborn. I remember the day he laid that first support beam, told me it'd stand longer than the town itself. Then he looked at me, dead serious, and said, unless Jake tears it down trying to fish off of it. Jake laughed softly, the memory flickering like an old slide. He had been maybe 10, dangling a rusted tackle box over the edge of the frame while his father worked below. He could still feel the sun on his neck and the rough texture of the beam beneath his legs. It had been one of the first times he'd been allowed to come to the job site, and he wore it like a badge of honor, muddy shoes and all. You think a fish is going to jump up here to meet you? His dad had hollered. Use your brain, not just your boots. That was his father, equal parts builder and philosopher, rarely soft, but never absent. Jake had grinned back at him, legs swinging off the ledge, too proud to admit that he didn't really care about the fish. He just wanted to be near his dad. I guess he thought I'd finish it, Jake said, eyes tracing the skyline, or at least that I'd understand why he started it. Walt studied him a moment, then nodded once. We all thought that. You had his eyes, even back then. Same eyes, just not as tired. Jake looked down. He hadn't realized how tired he'd become until someone else said it. He wasn't just weary from travel. This was something deeper. The kind of exhaustion that settles in when you've been carrying things too long. Regret, distance, expectations. Walt shifted back inside. Well, you go on and see Pastor Allen. He'll talk your ear off about legacy and the call and all that churchy stuff. Just know this, your dad wasn't building that bridge for himself. He was building it for what came next. Jake didn't ask what that meant. He already knew, and it scared him more than he wanted to admit. The old white chapel sat at the end of Maple Avenue, tucked between the weeping willows and memories Jake hadn't asked to revisit. Its steeple was a little crooked now, and the paint peeled like it had grown tired of trying to look pristine. But it still stood. So did Pastor Allen's old green pickup, parked slightly askew in its usual spot like it had been there since 1974. The same bumper sticker clung stubbornly to the tailgate. God's not done yet. faded and peeling at the edges like even it had weathered a few disappointments. On the way, Jake passed the corner house with the blue shutters, the one with the garden full of wildflowers that refused to grow in straight rows. It looked almost the same as when he was a kid, though the paint had faded and the porch sagged a little more. He remembered racing his brother down the sidewalk here, cutting through that garden like it was a finish line no one had given them permission to cross. The scent of lilacs still drifted from the yard, faint, familiar, and uninvited. Funny how a smell could drag you backward faster than any detour. The church door creaked open before he even reached it. Thought I heard those boots, came a voice from inside, steady and familiar. You always had a heavy hill when your heart was full. Jake stepped into the foyer where the scent of lemon oil and old hymnals greeted him like old friends with too many opinions. Pastor Allen stood by the coat rack, a hand still resting on the doorframe. His hair was whiter now, and his frame smaller, but his eyes, those still blue eyes, were just as clear. Jake used to think they could see right through him. He still wasn't sure they couldn't. Pastor, Jake said with a nod. Jake Weston, he replied, with a smile that held both welcome and weight. You've been a long time coming. Jake shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. Yeah, I got your letter. Good. Then it did its job. They stood there for a moment in the silence that only two men carrying different pieces of the same grief can share. Not awkward, not strained, just the kind of silence built between people who've buried more than they've spoken aloud. Pastor Allen motioned toward his office. Come on, let's sit a moment. The office hadn't changed much. The same books lined the shelves, some open so often their pages curled like leaves in drought. A crooked photo of Jake's dad with a hammer in one hand and a Bible in the other sat on a desk, right next to a coffee mug that read, Too blessed to be stressed. Jake sank into the old leather chair across from him. So, he said, resting his arms on his knees, why now? Pastor Allen folded his hands. Because the bridge is still waiting. Jake sighed. So is half the town. Some want it torn down. Others think it stalks them with the echoes of the past. They're both wrong. It's not stalking anyone, Pastor Allen chuckled, and tearing it down won't heal the ache. You know what your dad used to say about that bridge? Jake shook his head slowly. That bridge ain't for traffic, it's for trust, Pastor Allen quoted, voice soft. Said Silver Ridge didn't need another road, it needed another reason to believe. He leaned back, hands laced across his stomach. It was never about the planks and the beams. It was about the people who'd walk it, the ones who needed to know they still belonged. Jake leaned back, looking up at the ceiling like it might offer some divine footnote. And you think I'm the reason? Pastor Allen smiled. No, I think you're the next beam. Jake blinked. That's annoyingly poetic. Comes with a job, Pastor Allen said, grinning, then softer. You don't have to carry the whole span, Jake. You just have to be willing to hold some of the weight. They sat for a while longer, the hum of an old space heater filling the space between questions Jake wasn't ready to ask and answers Pastor Allen wasn't in a hurry to give. At one point, Pastor Allen reached for a small wooden cross on the shelf and turned it over in his palm, absent-mindedly, like he did when he was praying without saying a word. Jake noticed but didn't interrupt. Outside, the sun began to drop behind the ridge, stretching long shadows over a town still waiting on something, or someone, to finish what was started. Back in the truck, Jake sat with the door open and one boot on the ground, like he couldn't decide whether to leave or stay. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of river moss and firewood smoke smells that belonged to childhood campouts and after dinner walks with the man who walked 2 steps ahead. He pulled the visor down, and a folded scrap of paper fluttered into his lap. Jake recognized the handwriting immediately. His father's blocky, no-nonsense print. Measure twice, cut once, and don't let fear hold the nail gun. Love, Dad. It had been taped inside the visor since high school, tucked up there like a secret blessing. Jake had almost forgotten it existed. Almost. It was wrinkled now, sun bleached at the corners and soft from time, but the words still held like cured lumber, unshaken. He closed his eyes, and the memory played like it always did when he let it. They were standing on the skeletal beams of the bridge, Jake, barely 16, trying to act taller than he felt. His dad stood beside him, hand steadying the plank as Jake lined up a rusty nail. You're aiming too fast, his dad said. I'm trying to be efficient, Jake muttered, wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans. Efficient is good, his dad replied, but accuracy keeps the thing from falling apart. Jake had rolled his eyes. You think I'm just building this bridge for the town? His father asked. Jake shrugged. Aren't you? His dad had looked out at the half-built span and said quietly, I'm building this so you'll know how. Then he added, almost like a throwaway line, one day you'll need to. Jake hadn't understood what he meant back then, but the words stuck, like sawdust in a collar, like a nail that won't come loose no matter how much time passes. He carried that moment like a spare tool in his belt, forgotten until it was needed. Now, sitting in the hush of twilight, Jake finally whispered the question he hadn't let him ask until now. God, what if I don't know how? No answer came, no booming voice, no burning bush, just the faint click of metal in the toolbox behind him and the soft groan of the wind pushing against the door. The kind of silence that didn't feel empty, just ancient, like the earth was still listening. But maybe that was the point. Maybe faith wasn't about having all the plans, just showing up at the site with your boots on and your heart cracked open. Jake looked out at the bridge one more time, still incomplete, still waiting. So was he. He reached up, tucked the note back in the visor, and started the engine. That is the end of chapter 1. Thank you for joining me on this adventure, and I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time for the next chapter. Have a great day.